Okay, now I introduce you.
All right.
Hi, this is Meta Spencer, and I think I'd like to go to California for a change. I haven't been to California to see my friend Bill Fletcher in a couple of months. So it's time for us to get caught up. Bill and his friend Craig Smith are the authors of a book called Reaching Net Zero, which came out about a year ago. And you can guess what it's about. It's about climate change. And it was a very timely book, it is still a very interesting book. But over the last year, they've been out giving talks to people and so on. And I think by now he's probably ready to tell us what he would do if he was starting over, you know. If you were rewriting the book today, what would you say that's the difference? Because now you've found out some exciting things have been going on since then, and maybe some bad things. So let's bring us up to date about the state of the world and what we have to learn from what you gave us a year ago. Hi, Bill.
Hi, how are you? And thanks for having me back. I always enjoy these conversations. Well, Meta, as you and I have talked over the months, Craig and I wrote a book on not just what global warming is, but what can and should be done about it. And we had an action plan that we went over in one of your talks here about what has to be done to stop global warming. And I think the other thing that Craig and I did, we spent a lot of time reviewing forecasts and things like that. And one of our conclusions is that, yes, we have to stop global warming by reaching net zero, which is no greenhouse gas emissions. But we can't get there by 2050, which is the goal of the IPCC. It's the goal of the Biden administration in the US and in Europe and other things. And we think we have to do whatever we can to get there as soon as we can, but we are very, very doubtful that we could get there that quickly. And what our hope is that we will certainly be on a downward trend toward net zero by then, and that a lot of exciting things will be implemented to show that it can be achieved in time. But we think that getting there by 2050 is not going to work. But let's wait and see. I mean, if I could be surprised. But no matter what you do, I mean, you still have to do the things we listed in our action plan, whether you get there in 2050 or 2070. So, in preparing for today's conversation, I put together a couple of PowerPoint slides that we could go back and forth on. I know we don't want to look at a slide, the whole thing. So let me start, and maybe I could let me go back here. Oops, got the wrong one up. And can you see that?
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I titled this "Reaching Net Zero by 2050?" Because that's the goal. We should still pursue it, but I think we will probably not get there that quickly. And
but I think your tone of voice, it sort of sounds, to my mind, too comfortable about that. I mean, to me, if we don't get there by 2050, this is a catastrophe. But it sounds like you think, well, if we don't get there by 2050, we'll get there by 2060, maybe. I don't know what you mean, but it's like you're not upset about it.
I am in the sense that I'd like to do it, but if something can't be done, let's try. I mean, that's not a bad goal. But the fact is that global warming continues. Our emissions on a global basis have not trended down yet. We're still on a path to double our emissions in the next 50 years. So, a lot of good things are going on, but they're not big enough and fast enough to even make a difference, a measurable difference today.
But you sound as if that doesn't give you, I mean, to me, that sets my hair on fire.
Well, I mean, I could be let's be realistic. if it can't be, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything. I'm saying we should do a lot more than we're doing today.
Okay.
And, so I'm not backing off on 2050. I'm just saying if we do everything we say we're going to do, we're still not going to get there by then, but we'll be, our emissions by then would be much lower than they would be if present trends continue. And the big thing is we'll be on a downslope instead of an upslope. And by then I would anticipate that we would be well into an economy, an energy economy based on renewables, and fossil fuels will be on their last legs. So,
Okay, and maybe that's the difference between what you and I expect. I think if by 2050, if we haven't settled everything or a lot of things by then, there'll be about 1 billion people dead by then.
No, it won't. I mean, you'll have a much bigger mitigation problem, migration problem. But, it's not like 1 billion people are going to die in 2050. This is not a nuclear war or anything like this. And I think that at some point being unrealistic, it hurts. I think we need we shouldn't try to set up a goal for another 5 years or so. Let's see how much progress we make. And maybe we can get there by 2050. But if we can't, I think if we're lying to ourselves that 2050 is still a goal and it's really going to be 2060 or 70, the public gets discouraged, people lose interest. So I'm not ready to move the goalpost yet.
Okay, here's where we differ.
Yeah.
I want to scare the daylights out of everybody.
Well,
and reassure people and not get them too upset. So I think the difference is that if we don't scare the daylights out of people, we won't make it.
I would take a very different approach. When you say 1 billion people could die, that's not true.
You better listen to some of the people that I've been interviewing, and
I think they're wrong.
I think the catastrophe of, for example, the methane emissions in the Arctic could be happening at any minute. It could be very, very imminent, and this would be a level of disaster that would be, way beyond like 1 billion people. So, there really are differences of opinion. It isn't a matter of opinion. It's different projections about how serious the threats are. And
you and I talked a while back about tipping points and like methane release, the collapse of the monsoon, a changing of the Gulf Stream. These are nonlinear events that could happen, and I would agree. The longer it takes us to get to where we're going, the risk of hitting one or more of these tipping points goes up. And yes, we could have one of those things that leads to a very dramatic change that would scare everybody. But the thing I'm afraid of is that the public gets very jaded when they hear, people projecting all kinds of things, and they just dismiss it. But I think that let's go down this list very quickly, and then we can talk about the points you want to emphasize. First of all, I think the good news is that, in my mind, what I call the train has left the station, in the sense that the Biden administration's in. I think all of the governments around the world are aware of and doing something about global warming. They may not be doing enough, but I think we've reached a point beyond which we can't turn back. If Donald Trump gets reelected, he won't be able to deny global warming and stop the train, in my mind. So in that sense, momentum is moving in the right direction. And things like the automobile companies are in a race to see who can develop electric vehicles the fastest. So the momentum is now, in my mind, shifting towards doing something about global warming. The thing I would say as a number 2 point is we're going to be a lot of people will be disappointed because it'd be a very sloppy process. There'll be failures, there'll be waste, there'll be inefficiency, there'll be things that don't work. You know, and you can already see this, like the failure in Texas with the grid going down in the winter storm a few months ago. People are jumping up and down saying, "Oh, that just proves that renewable energy doesn't work." So or the
Why would
hurricane.
they have concluded that?
Well, I mean, they're saying that the grid failure was largely the fact that wind and solar didn't produce electricity, but it was also a failure. The nuclear power plant went down. Natural gas pipelines froze up because they weren't winterized. But I mean, you'll hear a lot of people who will be looking at the failures and trying to convince others that this is just proof that we're wasting our time or wasting our money. But I think we need to recognize up front that we're trying to do with renewables in, let's say, 30 years, what it took us over 100 to do with fossil fuels, to build the infrastructure, the global infrastructure.
Uh-oh, I'm not hearing you.
Also, this is a global effort and there'll be coordination failures and so forth. So my point is, let's just accept the fact that this is not going to be a nice, clean thing like the space program that everybody likes to remember. It's going to be a lot of false starts, failures, waste. I mean, you start reading now about all of the mineral shortages we're going to have because we don't have enough cobalt or lithium. But these are problems that people solve. I mean, we can find oil in the North Sea. I'm sure we can find more lithium and cobalt if we put our minds to it. So that one thing I would say is that we can't, there's going to be a lot of noise about this isn't working or this is wasteful or this is a stupid program. But that's just going to be part of progress. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind. China gets a lot of bad press because they're the largest user of coal and producing and the largest CO2 or the largest greenhouse gas emitter today. But the fact is, China is in the lead in renewables, in electric car production, in wind turbine production, in solar panels, in battery production. I think the US is behind, and I think we're starting to realize that. If we want to buy all our solar panels from China over the next 30 years, just let's let present trends continue.
Tell me about their batteries. I didn't know they were doing well. What have they discovered and what are they doing by way of batteries?
Well, I mean, they are the world's largest producer of electric vehicles, and they consume more electric vehicles. They have almost the entire world supply of electric buses, for instance. So China and they're revising their cities to accept electric vehicles. So China has been at this for a long time, and they have targeted they have an industrial policy and they've targeted certain industries for the future. And one of them is renewables. And I think they currently produce about 60 or 70% of the solar panels produced in the world. They're the world's largest producer of wind turbines. They produce more car batteries than anybody else. They dominate the supply chain for raw materials for battery production. They have almost cornered the market in lithium and cobalt, for instance. There's economies of scale. I mean, this is an engineer, you know about these things, is the more you produce, the smarter you get. And China is, I've got a slide I can show, is way ahead of us in implementing electric vehicles, wind turbines, solar farms, and other key technologies and nuclear power. And they want to be the world leader in these industries because they think global warming's real and And these are growth opportunities. And
Well, I had heard that I believed that batteries are kind of uh, the glitch, that they haven't, that batteries, we'd be a lot better off if we had better batteries, that they haven't really solved the battery problem as well as they should.
I would
Are the Chinese, do they have better batteries so far? Are they making better ones than North American companies or European?
Well, I mean, I think Tesla, for instance, and Elon Musk, he is the Tesla vehicles are bestsellers in China of all things, but his biggest automobile plant is in Shanghai, not in the United States, because he's going after the Chinese market, which is smart. But the other thing people don't realize is they say, "Oh, batteries are a big problem." Batteries are lagging solar and wind, but there's dramatic changes in battery production today for two types of batteries: the ones you use in automobiles, and also what they call utility scale batteries, big batteries that are not mobile, so they don't have the weight problems that you need to solve with lithium-ion batteries, and that it can be used to store hours and days worth of electricity for a utility company, which is very key to making renewables work in an electric grid. And so the projection is that today, a battery for an electric car may cost, let's say, $13,000. It's the biggest single cost of an electric vehicle. But they're saying that by 2025 or so, that the battery costs will go way down because of the economies of scale that are being produced in huge quantities in big factories, and people are getting smarter. And this is based on lithium-ion batteries, and so they're saying that at some point, in the next 5 or so years, maybe it's a little longer, there'll be no cost penalty to buying an electric vehicle. And there are new technologies that are being pursued, alternatives to lithium. And then lithium batteries, one of their problems is they have a liquid electrolyte that is flammable. So you read about these fires of lithium-ion batteries where the battery fails or short circuits or overheats and catches on fire. They're looking at solid state batteries where they use basically a plastic film instead of the electrolyte. So there's a lot of things that's not fully exposed to the public, with dramatic changes in the cost and performance of batteries.
What are the alternatives to lithium?
Well, I mean, I read something about, let's see, what was that? I think it was an aluminum battery, replacing. There's some advantages to that because aluminum has more electrons per atom or something like that. But let's just say that a lot of people and a lot of money and a lot of smart people are trying to come up with better alternatives. Mm-hmm. And there's two problems. One is to perfect the lithium-ion battery, and the other one is to come up with a better battery. And so there's a race on, and this is good. It's competition. So batteries, in my mind, I mean, and companies like Volkswagen, they're betting something like $80 billion on electric vehicles. GM's up their investment to $35 billion. Ford is 25. These companies wouldn't be putting up that kind of money if they didn't feel that if they thought that the battery is going to be a permanent disadvantage for electric vehicles. And then other people will say, "Oh, we got to recycle all these batteries. There'll be a huge pollution problem." Well, we have a pollution problem today with tires and old cars and everything else. But the thing is, with batteries, you don't destroy the lithium and the cobalt and the other materials in the battery. They're not consumed, they're not burned up like fossil fuels, and so they can be recycled. So I think the battery problems, longer battery life, so you can get a 300-mile vehicle, which seems to be a goal. If I can go 300 miles without recharging on my electric vehicle, that's a big deal. So this gets to the fourth point, this is one of several very exciting things underway. I think that, battery technology will become less of a cost and less of a performance issue on electric vehicles, for instance. And batteries for utilities will become, there's a lot of big battery projects for utilities to store electricity for a few hours or a day to smooth out supply and demand. And but some of the very exciting projects underway, in my mind, just reading about one. I mean, with our I used to be in work for a big oil and gas company and Bechtel, and we built the Jebel Industrial Complex in Saudi Arabia in the middle of the desert, and people were drilling for oil in the North Sea. We need those kind of scale projects for renewables, and that's happening. I mean, one project that I mentioned to you, I think in an email, was there in Australia. They're planning a huge solar farm in Northwest Australia, which is pretty barren. They're going to have transmission lines take the power to Perth, and then they're going to have a 2,500-mile long undersea cable to take that power to Singapore. That's a big deal. I mean, that's thinking big about renewables. There's another project in Europe where they're putting in a solar plant in Tunisia, and they're going to take power under the Mediterranean by cable to Europe.
Mhm.
And we talked about Germany. Germany's trying to lead in Europe in renewables, but they don't have the weather and so forth, and so maybe they need to start getting their power from Kazakhstan or something where there's a lot of desert and sunlight. So I think that people are starting to think very big about things. And another big one, and lead into the fifth point. The Wall Street Journal had a very good article on Japan and the hydrogen economy. I mean, Japan has almost no domestic energy resources, and they have a lot of problems with solar because they don't have a lot of land. They got a lot of mountains and a lot of people and a lot of urban development, but they don't have deserts and open areas that they can convert to large solar farms. And so they're investing billions into facilities, and they're building a ship that will take liquefied hydrogen or ammonia, which is another form of hydrogen, transporting it to Japan. And there's a project in Australia that's in the planning stage to build a huge solar farm, not to produce electricity, but to produce electricity that will then be used for electrolysis to produce hydrogen. So
Mhm.
Japan is sort of preparing to start importing hydrogen, just like they're importing natural gas and oil today. And so the Japanese government wouldn't be committing billions of dollars to this kind of effort. And Europe's the same way. I mean, in Sweden, they're developing a process to make steel without coke, which is a coal product. They're using hydrogen instead of coke.
Oh.
I've read other projects in Europe where they're repurposing natural gas pipelines to start to be in a position where they could use those pipelines to distribute hydrogen instead of natural gas.
Hmm.
So these are things that aren't hitting the press. They're not in the news today. But if you read things on the internet and pay attention to it, I think there's some very exciting things going on right now. And
By the way, when you talk about sending power very long distances, how much loss of energy is there when you send it that way, undersea, for example? And is it important to use direct current for that?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things here. Transmission of electricity. Well, first of all, you use a lot of energy pumping oil or natural gas from, let's say, Texas to New York. I mean, there's a lot of energy needed to pump that fluid or pump that gas. So fossil fuels use a lot of energy in the transportation system themselves. Electricity is a much more efficient form of energy to transport long distances. And the thing is, the higher the voltage, of transmissions, the lower the losses. And then DC power has less loss than AC power. So if you have a long transmission line, if you transmit that power as DC electricity at high voltage, the losses, the transmission losses are less than if it is alternating current at the same voltage. The penalty is that you have to take AC power that comes out of a generator and then convert it to DC to put it into the transmission line and then convert it back at the other end. So, there's some pluses and minuses there, but in the US and China, we have hundreds of miles of transmission lines at high voltage DC that are very, very efficient. So, and the number that sticks in my mind that I've read is that, distribution losses for electricity, transmission and distribution are in the order of 8% or something like that. It's less than 10%. So, if you can transport electricity undersea from Australia to Singapore, the losses can't be that great.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. And that leads to the other thing. I mean, we're now starting to see some projects in the US where, for renewables, you need to store a certain amount of energy because the renewables are not completely reliable. You need to match supply and demand. And so they do have, they're putting in some huge, what they call utility scale batteries to store electricity. So you can adjust minute to minute and hour to hour variations. But the other thing they're starting to do is use some of that electricity to produce hydrogen. And that hydrogen can be stored as a gas. And then when you need it, you can run that gas, use that gas to drive a turbine or a fuel cell, but I think they're talking about turbines now. So you can use hydrogen as an energy storage medium. And hydrogen, the big thing with hydrogen is the cost. And so as a renewable energy gets cheap, if renewable energy is cheap enough, then it becomes economical to produce hydrogen and use that as a cost-effective fuel, let's say in competition with natural gas.
That's green hydrogen, right?
Green hydrogen, yeah. I mean, you can produce hydrogen today, but you need natural gas to do that. So, I've been reading about a hydrogen economy for over 50 years because it has a lot of advantages. When you burn hydrogen, the waste product is not CO2, but H2O, water. And you can also consume the hydrogen in a fuel cell, which produces electricity without combustion. So, if we can produce enough hydrogen cheap enough and start transporting it in pipelines, you could have electric vehicles powered by fuel cells rather than batteries. So there could be a little race there to which is better. In some of the big truck projects in the U.S., to produce over-the-road trucks that are electric have been based on fuel cells, not batteries. So I think. There seems to be a move in the direction of, electricity is going to get cheap enough that hydrogen can become a viable form of energy. And that has lots of advantages. And they're talking about hydrogen being a way to power airplanes or ships where, you can't have, where electricity is not a practical alternative. And then the other thing is, today we make huge quantities of ammonia, which is NH4, one nitrogen atom and 4 hydrogen atoms. And that's much easier to transport because you don't have to cool it enough to make it liquid. So we already have a huge infrastructure to distribute ammonia, which is used as a nitrogen fertilizer in agriculture. So it's produced and distributed worldwide. And so, a viable alternative is also to distribute hydrogen in the form of ammonia, not just hydrogen gas.
Because it's more convenient to transport. Is that the idea?
Well, it's more convenient and you already know how to do it. You don't have to, if you wanted to liquefy hydrogen, I don't know the exact temperature, but it's got to be very, very cold. or under very high pressures. But if it's in the form of ammonia, NH4, you don't have to cool it that much. You can compress it more easily, and you can and today we already transport it around the world in tanks and in pipelines. So we know how to handle ammonia very well. And you can even burn ammonia as a fuel. The disadvantage there, from what I understand, is that the nitrogen goes through the combustion process and becomes a nitrous oxide, which is a pollutant. But you could perhaps strip the hydrogen and use it in a fuel cell and let the nitrogen go back into the atmosphere, because the atmosphere is already about 75% nitrogen. So it has.
I know a guy who has for years been arguing that we ought to have cars run on ammonia. In fact, he made a car and he drove it across Canada, but everybody who knows him says, I wouldn't get in that car with you because it
could blow up or something.
Could blow up, yeah.
Well,
so maybe he's not completely, I don't know.
Well, let me go on to the next bullet, which I think gets to the point you and I were talking about at the very beginning. I don't think the public's on board yet. I mean, people are increasingly aware of global warming, but if you told people that we needed a carbon tax and that would add 50 cents a gallon to the price of gasoline, there'd be a revolution. And I don't think the public, they're aware of it, but people I know, it doesn't hurt them. I mean, it's just something they read about. They don't experience it. And
the Canadians are a little bit ahead of Americans on that, I would say, because we do have some carbon tax, I suppose. Yeah. And the Supreme Court has just said, yes, the federal government can demand it, require it. So
yeah, I think that's progress. California, I think, is teaming with Canada on that. But I mean, I think that and this gets back to the issue of the tipping points. I mean, do we need a Pearl Harbor or a 9/11 kind of event from a global warming perspective to get the public to wake up and support this? Or will they just come along as politicians and businesses are moving in the right direction? But I think we're seeing that in California, we have bold plans, but we do a terrible job on implementing those plans, with our bullet train and things like that. And and there's already starting to see a lot of opposition to transmission lines, not in my backyard. You can't build a solar farm there because of this turtle or this lizard.
Well, but California has wildfires. Now that if anything would wake people up, you'd think having a wildfire coming at you would do it. And yet it doesn't seem to. Yesterday, I made a talk show that I labeled last night. The title is "Please Frighten Us All!" Exclamation point. That's the title of the thing, because we had this conversation yesterday about whether or not we really need to have people get emotional. And I think that's the thing. We have to get people really emotional, because otherwise they treat this as just another, word magic kind of game where I don't think people take it seriously, but they have to become aware that, doom is coming. It's serious.
Well, I mean, I think there's two, maybe we don't need a wake up call. Maybe as we make progress, the public will say, gee, this is impressive. This is good. It's not hurting me at all. Maybe I have to pay a little more for gasoline. Or gee, these electric vehicles are great. We have something like, 40 or more electric vehicles will be introduced to the market over the next 5 or 6 years. So, I have a hybrid vehicle, but I'm not buying an electric vehicle today, but I may in 5 years say, hey, I'd rather have my friends that drive Teslas, and that's sort of the big thing to have here. And all the others are around. They love them. they wouldn't buy a car with an internal combustion engine. And so, if people start to see electric vehicles taking off, if they see that we're getting more of our power from renewables and it's not a catastrophe, the utilities, the electric grid is being modernized to handle variable power. Maybe they'll come along without any kind of a wake-up call. But I think right now we still, Craig said the big three we had. One of the big three was educate the public, and we still have a long way to go in my mind to educate the public.
I think it's not just a matter of educating the public, because I do this every day of the week.
Yeah.
No, 5 days a week, just as we're doing now. We talk rationally, and
Yeah.
a few people watch it, but rationality is not enough. I think emotion is required. So education is a thing that where you're not expected to get your classroom into a panic. And I think what we need to do is get people more into a panic. That's what Greta Thunberg says. She says, I don't want you to be comfortable. I don't want you to be reassured. I want you to panic. And I think she's right.
Well, I would argue that too, and I would argue that the longer we continue with what we're doing, we can approach a tipping point that we couldn't reverse after we trip it. But I also would say, hey, putting up scary numbers that are easily rebutted, in my mind, just sort of adds to the public skepticism of the whole thing. And so, but anyway, I think educating the public, we still have a long way to go. But I think the public's aware of the issue, and I think maybe the Biden administration, they've only been in office a short time. Maybe we'll get ahead of steam, and everybody will start to get behind this. But I think the big thing, the next bullet, California and the U.S. have major implementation problems in my mind. California has big objectives, but the thing I look at is, can we actually pull it off? And I'm very skeptical. Our wildfires have a lot to do with transmission lines failing. One of the big fires that wiped out Paradise, it was a 100-year-old transmission line that was poorly maintained. It caused the fire. And our bullet train was still struggling, since 2008, and we haven't gotten a single mile of usable track, and it's just a total fiasco.
So sad. It's just a legal problem, isn't it? That you can't.
No. Let me tell you what the problem is.
Eminent domain to force people to sell their property, their rights to you, or no?
Well, the problem with it, here we are 7 years after we started construction, and we still haven't gotten the total right of way, which is the state's responsibility.
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Why not? Can't you just, say, well, here's how much you were going to pay for your land. Take it, no, not take it or leave it. You take it because you got nothing else.
Then you get environmental groups in concern. You get lawyers involved. You get lawsuits. And that's what I wrote an op-ed that nobody published. But California, if we talk about what California has to do to go renewables, we need to more than double our electricity production. And I've got a slide I'll show you, and produce all of that with renewable energy, solar and wind. And that's not hard to do in California. We've got over 1,000 miles of windy coastline. We've got thousands of square miles of desert or marginal agricultural land, old oil fields that could be dedicated to solar and wind. But we need a master plan. We say, here's where we're going to put it. Because the other thing that's good, you don't want to put your solar farm or your wind farm in downtown LA, but you got to get a transmission line to get the power there. And there's a lot of opposition to transmission lines, and nobody wants to see a wind turbine from their window. So in my mind, if we don't have a master plan of some kind at the state level and say, here's where the power is going to be generated, here's where it's going to be transmitted, and here's what we got to do, and everybody get on board, it's going to, if we have to fight it out land parcel by land parcel as we are with the bullet train, we'll never get there. Maybe you build a wind farm, but you won't get the transmission line, and then it'll be a lot of finger pointing. It's always somebody else's fault.
Tell
So
me, can I distract you a little bit with this bullet train idea? Because it's on my mind a lot lately for another reason. About 10 years ago or less, we had a fairly lively conversation in Canada about the idea of putting in a bullet train from, let's say, Quebec City through Montreal to Ottawa to Toronto to maybe Hamilton or maybe to Windsor down toward Detroit. And the whole thing kind of fizzled. I don't know whatever happened to nobody maybe thought it was economically feasible. I don't know. But at any rate, nothing has come of it. But I'm concerned because there is a company called General Dynamics, which is based in London, Ontario, which is about halfway between here and Windsor or Detroit. And they are producing armored personnel carriers for the Saudi Arabians to use against, who knows, the Yemenis or their own population. We're not quite sure where they're using these, but they're definitely not nice people, and they don't deserve to be receiving these things. So the Canadian government doesn't want to shut them down, even though the public wants them shut down, because we'd have to pay a big fee for breaking the contract. We're talking about a big, big contract. So the thing is that the company where they're making these things used to make trains. And my argument is, let's go back to looking at the idea of this bullet train. Why don't we shut this thing down and guarantee a job to all the people now working there by saying we're going to turn it over back into creating a bullet train?
I have a better idea.
What's your idea?
Let them go bankrupt. Meta, if you did
no,
that,
because listen, politically, that's where the problem is. If you are the prime minister, you don't want to have that happen to your workers, because you're talking about thousands of workers would be jobless. And of course, there'd also some people with investments, but maybe the investment end of things, or it might be more something you could live with. But the idea of increasing the joblessness in a certain area is a sure recipe for getting defeated the next election.
I know, but that's the problem. But realistically, you're going to build a bullet train to employ 1,000 workers. If you work the math, you'd say, hey, it's going to cost us $50-75 billion, maybe more, to build this train. And that's to save 1,500 jobs or whatever, some number like that. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars.
No, I get your point. That's why I raised it, because the question is, people were talking about the financial viability of the plan on its own way before, 10, 15 years ago, way before we had to think about the jobs or the connection to these armored personnel carriers. So what I want to know is how widespread is the use. I mean, a lot of countries have bullet trains now, Europe, all over the place. And how, I don't know what considerations one has to have, but for the purpose of global, climate change issues, trains are a whole lot better than.
Well, I don't agree with that. I mean, let's talk about the bullet train, which is real. I mean, first of all, we're spending 2 or 3 times the cost per mile of, let's say, France or China to build the train. It's very inefficient. And here. And then the question is, by the time it's finished, the current cost estimate is $100 billion to finish the project. And I bet if the federal government gave California $100 billion today, the cost estimate would go up. By the time this train is finished, will anybody use it? And will it require a subsidy just to operate because it costs so much? And here's so I'm a little skeptical about this. And the other thing, the bullet train was sold. I remember in 2008, the public thing to get a bond issued for it, that it was going to be carbon neutral from day one. because we were going to plant millions of trees to offset all of the carbon produced during construction. I mean, think about this train from a global warming point of view. How much money, I mean, how much CO2 is being produced by the steel, the cement, the construction equipment. This is an environmental disaster during construction if we're worried about global warming. And we haven't planted a single tree. So it's just a bunch of bullshit, excuse my language, by the politicians to get the bond issue approved. And since '08, we haven't planted any trees. The project is hopelessly behind. The budget has tripled, or the cost estimate. And these are the boondoggles that I don't want to see happen with global warming. And that's why I got to the second point. It's going to be a sloppy process because there'll be some of that during implementation. But, my feeling is California talks big. If we go through, address our climate goals on a business as usual basis, we will not make it. Already in California, we have the highest electricity cost in the U.S., except for Alaska and Hawaii, which
Why is that?
Just because it's very regulated, and we've got a huge, we've got regulated utilities. Texas produces power at half the cost of California, roughly. It's much more deregulated. And right now,
I don't understand that. What does regulation have to do that creates makes it?
Well, in California, the rates are set by a utility commission.
But they don't do it just picking a number out of the air. They must have some rationale for setting.
But it's politicians and big business setting the rate. In Texas, it's based on competition, and in other parts of the country, they can produce power for a lot less. We're supposed to be, we are a state that is very heavily endowed. And why, if our electricity costs go up rather than down as we go green, that's going to slow the transition to renewables.
But I just don't see why regulation inherently should make it more expensive. I mean,
I think that if it's possible, in some cases, regulation's the only way. But by far, giving people choice and competition is by far the best way to get the cheapest solution.
So how could you do that in California? Create a
we could deregulate electricity.
Huh?
We could but we're missing the big point is that California, in the studies I've looked at, we have to set aside something like 600 or more square miles. Think about that. That's a big area for solar, wind, and transmission lines. Now, does the state have 600 square miles that we set aside? Absolutely. But if we have to do it on a parcel by parcel basis, it'll take us forever. So I don't want to spend too much time on that point, but I'm just saying that, California, in my mind, is supposedly way ahead of others in the US on going green. And I think we haven't really done what we have to do yet. And I'm skeptical that we'll be able to accomplish it based on some prior examples. Can we move on? I mean, I don't want to spend too much time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just cover the other points very quickly. And it gets back to the point we're talking about. Energy costs are going to be a major force for change. If we want people to stop using natural gas, for instance, then electricity has to be cheaper, competitive. I mean, I replaced my gas furnace 6 or 8 months ago with a heat pump because it's going in the right direction. It's more expensive for me to heat my house with a heat pump than it was with gas, because gas is much cheaper. And
is it subsidized?
Yeah. You could say
that's the thing. If you keep subsidizing fossil fuels.
Yeah, but no. Let me give you complete the argument here. I mean, if I was paying the same prices of electricity as Texas was, or just the national average, it would probably be competitive. I'm guessing at the number, but California can't have a highly regulated economy and where everything costs too much, and that's true for housing and everything else in the state, and then expect to go green. I mean, we need to find out ways to get electricity to the customer cheaper, not more than we are today, as part of the solution. So I think, and the other big lesson we should learn is that in the US, we are beating our chest saying, oh, our greenhouse gas emissions have been flat for 10 years. All of that is due to the fact that we've been using natural gas instead of coal to produce electricity. And the reason that happened is that fracking came along and started producing large quantities of low-cost natural gas. And it was straight economics. The utility industry found it's much cheaper to produce electricity using natural gas than coal. And it wasn't government regulations or going green or anything else. It was straight economics that have led in the US to a dramatic decline in the use of coal to produce electricity, and being displaced by natural gas. So in my mind, economics are as important or more important than government regulations if we're going to get to where we want to go. And that gets to the point we talked earlier about electric vehicles. If 10 years, let's say 5-7 years from now, if it's just as expensive, just as cheap to buy an electric vehicle as a fossil fuel one, and they're much cheaper to operate and maintain, which is already true, people will naturally go to electrics. But if the price of electricity is high, so that it costs more to operate an electric vehicle, then that's a deterrent. So I think we just need to pay a lot of attention to the cost of energy. I'll just cover the next two quickly, and then we can go on. But the U.S. is reneging on a carbon tax. That was originally part of the Biden plan. That's one of the big three in my and Craig's.
Well, have they actually made that final decision?
No, they just not talking about it anymore.
And they aren't talking about it.
No, and the other thing is the word out. It's just not. It's dying quietly. The word out is it's unfair to low-income people because it's a regressive tax.
Well, give them money. Give them
I mean, there are ways to
Fareed Zakaria had a thing on that the other day.
He did. I watch his show every Sunday, and I saw that.
I do too. I thought it was really good.
Yeah,
and I mean, you can do it in such a way that it makes sense. It makes sense to the consumer that, okay, you have to pay more here, but I get it back.
Yeah. And I think, and I agree with him and with and economists in general, I think the single biggest thing we could do to go green is to have a genuine carbon tax, not some complicated cap and trade thing like we have in California that doesn't work and is so complicated it gets gamed by special interests. We need a simple carbon tax applied at the wellhead or the mine. You just tax carbon, period. And at the source, and everybody pays the price. And then you have to have a border adjustment tax so that if we have a carbon tax and China does not, for instance, that gets factored in. But I think the biggest single thing we could do to go green is to have a U.S. carbon tax, and you have to start off small. If you start off big, it would be too crippling to the economy, but you need to start off small and then increase it every year. And you could also, it's also going to be a great source of funds to support the government programs on green energy. Craig and I, our estimate is $40 carbon tax would be a ton, would produce maybe $250 billion a year, and that would increase as the tax went up. So I'm very disappointed that we're not talking about a carbon tax anymore. And we don't think of it as a tax. We say it's a fee
Mhm.
for dumping carbon dioxide and other pollutants into the atmosphere. It just shouldn't be free.
You know what, Bill, I think it's been 20 years now
Yeah.
since I made a PowerPoint
Yeah.
slide presentation, and I went around to churches all over Toronto giving talks using my PowerPoint thing.
Yeah.
You know, the point of the show, it was to say that we need to have a carbon tax.
Right. Yeah. I mean, everybody know. I mean, even the utility. I mean, even the industry, the fossil fuel industry is saying we need a carbon fee. And there's a little bit of self-dealing there. I mean, not self-dealing. I mean, they're saying, hey, tax carbon, and that would be a good way to move us in the right direction. And what they also want to do is they want to be immune to lawsuits. I mean, say, hey, if you're going to tax carbon, you can't then go turn around and sue us. But I think that everybody but the politicians would tend to agree that a carbon fee is a very good way to go. And we have to do it on a national basis. Canada's ahead of us. Europe's getting ahead of us. And
what does John Kerry say now about that?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what, I'm glad that the Biden administration created that position and put John Kerry involved. I haven't, I just read the newspapers and watch, I don't watch much TV. I don't watch news on TV, but I do read a lot of stuff on the internet. And I think it's too soon for him to have an impact. And then there's the last point, and then we can move on. I took more time, but the other thing that bothers me a lot is that all of the money we're spending in the Biden administration is borrowed money. There is no money. And that's where I think, a carbon fee would at least produce some revenue for the government to spend on green energy. But all of these big plans are deficit financed, and that's beyond the scope of our talk today, but I'm very worried about that long term.
Now, when you say you want to go on to other things, you got another slide, but we don't have much time left.
No, I mean, let me here's one I did for California. Can you see it?
Yeah.
And this is just what we're trying to do today. You can see that, and this is California, but if you generalize, it's basically representative for the US or the world. We get very little of our electricity from solar and wind. And the blue is our electricity production. In California, we import a lot of electricity. We have some from nuclear. We're going to shut down our last plant in 2026. And then there's the whole fossil fuels, natural gas, transportation, buildings, and others, the gray area on top. All of that has to be electrified. We need to replace fossil fuels with electricity. And so then you look over to the right and you see what that means. That means we have to go produce a hell of a lot of electricity by solar and wind, and to displace fossil fuels, and then there'll be some demand growth. So this is the challenge that I think we all need to keep in mind. I'll hit it. The other two. This is a good news slide. Here's electric vehicles. This just shows that they're starting to take off, and all of the automobile companies are in a race to. No one wants to be left behind in the electric vehicle competition. Ford Motor Company doesn't have competitive electric vehicles by the time Volkswagen and GM have many models in the market. Ford will go out of business, and they all know it. And what we see here is that Europe is really taken off, but China is still the big dog in electric vehicles. And the U.S. is behind. I mean, if you look at the chart on the right here, you can see that the U.S. Is pretty far down as far as electric vehicle penetration. We have to be careful here that if we don't start using more electric vehicles, we could wind up being substantially behind China and Europe, and that. Well, it
looks like we are already.
We are already. Yeah, I mean, we're already behind. And here's the last slide I was going to suggest we look at, and this is the latest data, or recent data, let's say, the top 10 countries. The left, the gray, is wind, and the yellow on the right is solar. And you can see, that China is way ahead in installer capacity in solar and wind. If you had a similar chart for electric vehicles or batteries, it would have a similar shape. I mean, China has, in my mind, correctly said, hey, renewable energy is a big deal and it's a growth industry, and we want to dominate that industry in the future. And they're ahead. They're implementing that plan. And we need to be.
Well, good for them and bad for us.
Yeah. And yes, China still has to use a lot of coal to produce the electricity they need. They have a huge pollution problem, all of that. So there's some negatives there, but they are implementing ahead of us. So I can just get rid of that right now. But that's what I wanted to cover. I hope that covers.
Yeah, it does. It does tell me kind of more like the state of the world as of June 2021, the state of the energy and climate situation, and it's daunting, frankly. I feel we need to, I don't know, do something to.
Well, I'm an optimist in the sense we're moving in the right direction. Things are starting to, the pace is accelerating. But I also want to be a realist that we're going to have lots of setbacks and disappointments along the way. But we're trying to do in 30 years what it took us 100 years to do with fossil fuels. And it's tough. Yeah. And let's you and I hope that we don't run into a tipping point before we get there.
That's the thing. Yeah. Okay, this has bin fun as usual. Yeah. And we'll have another update from you, and we won't go this long, but it's nice to be back in touch, and give my regards to Craig, and so keep your finger on the pulse. Okay.
Well, I hope this was useful.
Thanks. It is. Thanks so much, Bill.